I decided to take a rare day off work to surprise my wife, Emily. 7 years into our marriage, life had settled into the kind of rhythm that was both comforting and a little stale. We weren't unhappy, at least as far as I could tell, but we had fallen into predictable routines, dinners in front of the TV, short conversations about bills or schedules, and quick kisses before bed. Somewhere along the line, spontaneity had slipped through the cracks. So, when my boss mentioned I had some unused vacation days, I jumped at the chance. I imagined Emily's face lighting up when she saw me home unexpectedly. I'd bring her flowers, make her breakfast in bed, and spend the day together, just the two of us. Maybe it would remind us of the early days when we couldn't keep our hands off each other and laughed until our stomachs hurt. I stopped by the florist on my way home, picking up her favorite lilies, and grabbed some pastries from the bakery she loved. I felt a strange mix of nervousness and excitement, like I was a teenager planning a first date. As I drove home, the sunlight streaming through the windshield, I couldn't help but smile. This was going to be perfect. When I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The curtains in the living room were drawn, even though Emily usually liked to let in the morning light. I brushed the thought aside. Maybe she was still in bed or enjoying a lazy morning on the couch. I grabbed the flowers and bag of pastries and headed to the door, unlocking it as quietly as possible to preserve the element of surprise. The house was silent. No TV humming in the background, no soft notes from her favorite Spotify playlist drifting through the air. It was a quiet so complete it made me pause. Emily hated silence, she always needed some kind of background noise. Still, I figured she was probably catching up on sleep. After all, she'd mentioned feeling run down lately, and I wanted her to rest. The faintest smile tugged at my lips as I stepped inside, the scent of lilies filling the air. I set the pastries on the kitchen counter, arranging the flowers in the vase she kept near the sink. I felt giddy imagining her reaction when she saw them. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and moved toward the hallway leading to our bedroom. That's when I heard it. Voices. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but the muffled sound was unmistakable. My heart quickened. Maybe Emily was on the phone. But no, there was another voice, deeper, unmistakably masculine. I froze in place, the faint hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening in the quiet house. She's probably talking to a delivery guy, I told myself, though a knot was already forming in my stomach. The door to our bedroom was cracked just enough for the voices to carry. As I crept closer, the knot tightened, twisting into something sharp and cold. "It's fine," the man said. His voice was calm, confident, and disturbingly familiar. "He's at work, Emily. Relax." I stopped breathing. The knot in my stomach plummeted. I knew that voice. I would have recognized it anywhere. It was Paul. My father. Time seemed to slow. The air around me felt too thick, like I was moving through water. My brain scrambled for explanations that didn't make sense. Maybe he was fixing something in the house. He was always popping by unannounced to help out, and Emily had always welcomed his company. He was her father-in-law, after all, and a damn charming one at that. Maybe they were planning a surprise for me. That had to be it. But the tone of their conversation told a different story, too casual, too intimate. My feet moved before my brain could stop them, my hand pressing against the wall for balance as I inched toward the door. I leaned closer, the wood cool against my cheek, straining to hear. "You're too tense," Paul said, his voice dropping lower, almost teasing. "No one's going to find out." My breath hitched. Blood roared in my ears. My father, the man who had raised me, who had always seemed larger than life, was standing on the other side of that door, alone with my wife. Emily's laugh, soft and nervous, cut through the air. "I just feel guilty, that's all." Her voice, the one I knew so well, sounded alien to me now. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I was hearing. Guilt? Guilty about what? Don't, Paul replied. We've been careful. You deserve this. He doesn't give you what you need, he's too distracted with work. His words hit me like a slap. Too distracted. I worked hard to provide for us, to give us the life we dreamed of. My chest tightened as the realization began to settle. No. It couldn't be true. I know, but, Emily's voice trailed off. What if he? He won't, Paul cut her off. Now, come here. A rustle of sheets followed, and something inside me snapped. My hand pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as it swung wide. The scene before me was like something out of a nightmare. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing nothing but a robe, her hair disheveled in a way that wasn't from sleep. Paul stood in front of her, shirtless, his hand resting on her shoulder. Both of them froze, their eyes snapping to me in unison. Emily's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Paul's expression was harder to read, but there was no mistaking the guilt that flickered in his eyes. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the pounding of my heart, loud and furious in my ears. What? My voice cracked. What the hell is this? Emily scrambled to her feet, clutching the robe tighter around her. Jake, this isn't. Don't, I barked, my voice louder than I intended. I turned my gaze to Paul, the man I had idolized my entire life. How could you? Paul had the audacity to look calm. Jake, let's talk about this. You don't understand. I understand plenty, I snarled. You're in my house. With my wife. Emily stepped forward, tears brimming in her eyes. It's not what it looks like. Save it, I snapped, the anger bubbling to the surface. I can't believe this. My own father and my wife. I turned and stormed out of the room, my head spinning. Behind me, I heard Emily call my name, but I didn't stop. I needed to think, needed to process what I'd just seen. But one thing was already clear, nothing would ever be the same again. I barely remember the drive to my mother's house. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and my heart pounded in my chest like it was trying to escape. The betrayal I just witnessed was playing on a loop in my mind, every word, every expression seared into my memory. My wife. My father. Together. The two people I trusted most in the world. As I pulled into my mother's driveway, I hesitated. She had no idea what I was about to tell her, no way to prepare for the bomb I was about to drop on her carefully built life. My parents had been married for over 30 years. They weren't perfect, but I'd always admired the way they stuck together. What I just uncovered was going to destroy that image for both of us. The kitchen light was on, glowing warmly through the window. I could see her moving around inside, her familiar routine somehow grounding and surreal at the same time. This was the same house I'd grown up in, where my parents had hosted barbecues, celebrated birthdays, and laughed at the dinner table. It felt wrong to bring this kind of darkness into it, but there was no choice. My mother deserved the truth. I got out of the car, my legs feeling like lead as I walked up the steps and let myself in. She was standing at the counter, chopping vegetables for what looked like her famous beef stew, the comforting scent wafting through the room. Her back was to me, and she didn't hear me at first. "Mom," I said, my voice hoarse. She turned, startled, a smile lighting up her face. "Jake. What are you doing here?" She wiped her hands on a dish towel, her face filled with warmth and surprise. But as she looked closer, her expression shifted. "Honey, what's wrong? You look terrible." I opened my mouth, but the words caught in my throat. How do you say something like this? How do you tell your mother that her husband, the man she built her life with, betrayed her in the worst way possible? "Jake," she said again, stepping closer. "You're scaring me." I forced the words out, each one heavier than the last. Paul's been sleeping with Emily. Her smile froze, and for a moment, she didn't move. The knife slipped from her hand, clattering onto the counter. Her eyes searched my face, looking for some sign that I was joking, that this was some kind of terrible mistake. But there was nothing to find. "Jake," her voice was barely a whisper. "What are you saying?" I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, burying my face in my hands. The whole story spilled out, the unexpected day off, the voices in the bedroom, the scene I walked in on. Every detail poured out like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. She stood frozen as I spoke, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. When I finished, silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Her eyes were red, but the tears didn't fall. Instead, she took a deep breath and straightened her back. "We'll handle this together," she said, her voice steadier than I expected. "Mom," I started, but she held up a hand. "No, Jake. You were right to come to me. Your father," her voice broke for just a moment before she collected herself. "Your father needs to face what he's done. And Emily," her lips pressed into a thin line. "She'll have to answer for this too." Her resolve was comforting, but I could see the cracks beneath it. The way her hands shook as she picked up the knife and set it in the sink. The way her shoulders stiffened as though she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. I felt a pang of guilt for bringing this to her doorstep, but it wasn't something I could carry alone. "I'm going to call Deborah," I said, standing up. "She needs to know." Mom nodded. "Good. Let her know exactly what kind of daughter she raised." Deborah, Emily's mother, had always been fiercely protective of her perfect child. To hear her talk, Emily could do no wrong. I didn't relish the idea of shattering that illusion, but she had to hear it from me before someone else told her. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice cheerful. "Jake. What a surprise." I wasted no time. "Deborah, I need to talk to you about Emily. Something's happened." Her tone shifted immediately, concern creeping in. "What's wrong? Is she okay?" "She's fine," I said, the words bitter in my mouth. "But there's something you need to know. Emily has been having an affair." The gasp on the other end of the line was sharp. "What? That doesn't sound like Emily." "Are you sure?" "It's with my father." Silence. For a moment, I thought the line had gone dead. Then she spoke, her voice trembling. "Jake, I don't. How can you be sure?" "I walked in on them," I said bluntly. "This morning. In my bedroom." She let out a shaky breath, and I could hear the shock and disbelief giving way to anger. "I can't believe this. My Emily. With Paul. How could she?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," I said, pacing the kitchen. "But I need you to come over. We need to confront them together." She didn't hesitate. "I'll be there as soon as I can." I hung up and looked at my mother. She was sitting at the table now, staring at her hands. I could see the battle playing out in her mind, the love she still felt for my father warring with the betrayal she couldn't ignore. "What do we do now?" I asked softly. She looked up at me, her eyes hardening with determination. "We take back control. No more lies. No more secrets. They made their choices, Jake, and now they'll have to face the consequences." For the first time all day, I felt a flicker of hope. We weren't broken, not completely. Together, we could face whatever came next. By the time I pulled into my driveway with both mothers in tow, the knot in my stomach had only tightened. The house stood quiet, the curtains drawn like it was shielding itself from the chaos about to unfold. I parked, cutting the engine, and glanced at the two women beside me. My mother, Linda, sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes hard. Beside her, Deborah clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white. You ready for this? I asked, though none of us really were. Linda didn't answer, simply nodded and opened her door. Deborah followed suit, stepping out of the car with hesitation. As we approached the front door, my hands trembled slightly on the keys. I paused for a moment, letting the reality of what was about to happen sink in. Then I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The living room came into view, and there they were, Paul and Emily, sitting on opposite ends of the couch. Both of them were fully dressed now, but the nervous tension between them was unmistakable. Paul had his head down, avoiding eye contact, while Emily fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, her eyes red and puffy. They looked up as we entered, their faces shifting from guilt to panic. Emily stood quickly, taking a step toward me. "Jake, Sit," I said, my voice cold and cutting. She froze, her mouth snapping shut as she sank back onto the couch. Linda didn't wait for an invitation. She walked past me, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, and stopped directly in front of Paul. Without a word, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face with a resounding crack. The sound echoed through the room, and Paul flinched, his hand instinctively flying to his cheek. "How dare you destroy our family like this?" Linda's voice was trembling, but it carried an edge of fury I'd never heard from her before. 30 years, Paul. 30 years of marriage, of building a life together, and this is what you do?" Paul stammered, his face pale. "Linda, Don't you dare try to explain," she spat. "There is no explanation for this. None." Deborah turned her attention to Emily, her expression shifting from disbelief to anger. "You're a disgrace. Jake trusted you, and this is how you repay him." "Mom, please," Emily's voice cracked as fresh tears began to stream down her face. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Linda whirled on her. "You didn't mean for this to happen? What, did you just trip and fall into bed with my husband?" Emily looked completely overwhelmed now, her words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to justify herself. "It just happened. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped me. "Didn't mean to. You brought my father into our bed, Emily. Spare us the crocodile tears." Paul finally found his voice. "Jake, please. Let's talk about this. Man to man." I rounded on him, my jaw clenched. "Man to man? Is that what you think you are, Paul? A man? Because no man I respect would ever do what you did. You're supposed to be my father, my role model, and instead, my voice faltered, raw anger bubbling to the surface. "You're nothing." His shoulders sagged, but I didn't care. The sight of him sitting there, defeated, didn't stir even a shred of sympathy in me. Deborah was still railing at Emily, her voice sharp and full of disgust. "What's wrong with you? You had everything, a husband who loved you, a home, a future, and you threw it all away for this? For an affair with your father-in-law? Do you know how sick that is?" Emily buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably now. But no one moved to comfort her. "I thought I knew you," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less intense. "I thought we were building a life together, Emily. I trusted you. I loved you. And you did this? In our home? In the bed we shared?" She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry, Jake. I know I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking." "No," I said firmly. "You were thinking. You just didn't care. You made a choice, Emily. You both did. And now you'll have to live with the consequences." Linda turned to Paul, her eyes blazing. "Get out." Paul blinked, stunned. "What?" "You heard me," she said, her voice steady. "Get out of this house. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here another minute." He hesitated, as if hoping someone would intervene, but no one did. Finally, he stood, his movements slow and heavy. He turned to me, his mouth opening like he wanted to say something, but I shook my head sharply. "Don't," I warned. "You've already said enough." Paul grabbed his coat from the arm of the chair and shuffled toward the door, his head down. As the door closed behind him, the silence in the room felt deafening. Emily was still sobbing, but now her tears felt hollow, like she'd finally realized just how much damage she'd done. Deborah crossed her arms, glaring down at her daughter. "You'll stay here tonight," Deborah said curtly. "We'll sort out what happens next in the morning." Emily didn't respond, just nodded weakly. Linda sat down heavily in the chair across from me, her hands shaking slightly as she ran them over her knees. "Jake," she began, but her voice broke, and she couldn't continue. I reached over, taking her hand in mine. "We'll get through this, Mom," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure how. The room settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by Emily's occasional sniffles. For the first time in my life, my family felt completely shattered. But as I sat there, holding my mother's hand, I realized one thing: I wasn't going to let this define me. Not now, not ever. The house was unnervingly quiet the next morning. The kind of quiet that feels like the air has been sucked out of a room. I hadn't slept, instead pacing my room, reliving every moment of betrayal and thinking of what I needed to do next. There was no moving past this. No forgiveness, no therapy, no second chances. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was resolute. Emily and Paul had taken something sacred and destroyed it. Now, I was going to make sure they felt the weight of their actions. I sat at the dining table, sipping coffee, staring at my phone, and typing the message I had been composing in my head all night. My finger hovered over the send button for a moment before I pressed it with finality. The message was simple, direct, and devastating. "Caught my wife cheating with my father today. Pictures attached. Enjoy." The text went to everyone, our closest friends, both sides of the family, and even Paul's colleagues from his office. I included several photos I'd taken the day before, capturing the two of them in their guilty aftermath. One of Emily sitting on the bed, disheveled and panicked. Another of Paul standing shirtless, looking like a deer in headlights. No caption could have conveyed the betrayal better than those images. The fallout was immediate. Emily's phone buzzed on the couch where she'd left it, and she grabbed it, her face pale as she read the message. Her trembling hands dropped the phone, and her eyes darted to me. "Jake, what did you do?" Paul was sitting in the armchair across the room, his face buried in his hands. At the sound of Emily's panicked voice, he reached for his own phone. A groan escaped him as he read the message, and he glared at me. "You're ruining everything, Jake." I leaned back in my chair, my expression calm. "No," I said. "You ruined everything. I'm just making sure everyone knows who you really are." Emily lunged toward me, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Jake. You didn't have to do this. We can fix this, we can." "Fix this?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "How do you fix sleeping with your husband's father? How do you fix destroying 2 marriages? Tell me, Emily, I'd love to know." She crumbled onto her knees, sobbing into her hands. Deborah stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She hadn't said a word since she'd read the message herself, but the disappointment and disgust etched on her face said it all. Paul, ever the smooth talker, tried to reason with me. "Son, listen." "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "You're not my father anymore. Whatever bond we had, you destroyed it the moment you touched my wife. Do me a favor and lose my number." Paul's face twisted, a mixture of anger and shame. "You'll regret this," he muttered. I laughed bitterly. "The only regret I have is not realizing sooner what kind of person you are." The notifications on their phones kept coming as replies poured in. Shock, disbelief, condemnation, every response hit them like another blow. Friends who had once adored Emily were now calling her every name in the book. Family members who had looked up to Paul as a model husband and father were disowning him in real time. The fallout was swift and merciless. Linda arrived shortly after. I had called her earlier, letting her know what I'd done. She walked in, her expression stony as she surveyed the wreckage. Without a word, she handed Paul an envelope. "What's this?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "Divorce papers," Linda said coldly. "Consider them a parting gift." Paul stared at her, dumbfounded. "Linda, you can't." "I can," she interrupted. "And I already have. My lawyer's been working on them since yesterday. You'll find I'm not interested in negotiating. Just sign them and get out of my life." Paul stood, his face red with frustration, but he didn't argue further. He grabbed his coat and stormed out the door, slamming it behind him. Emily watched him leave, her sobs quieting as she turned to me. "Jake, please. Don't do this to us. I'll do anything to make it right." I stood and grabbed my bag, which I had packed during the night. "It's already done, Emily. There's no coming back from this." She crawled toward me, grabbing at my leg like a drowning woman reaching for a life preserver. "I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. Please, Jake, don't leave me." I pulled my leg away and looked down at her, feeling nothing but disgust. "You made your choice, Emily. Now you get to live with it." Deborah finally spoke, her voice icy. "Get up, Emily. You're embarrassing yourself." Emily flinched at her mother's tone but obeyed, stumbling to her feet. Deborah turned to me, her eyes filled with sadness. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I didn't raise her to be like this." I nodded, appreciating the sentiment but knowing it changed nothing. "I know, Deborah. But this is the end of the road." I left the house without another word, the door closing softly behind me. The crisp morning air hit my face as I stepped outside, a strange sense of relief washing over me. I was walking away from the life I thought I'd built, but I wasn't walking away empty-handed. I still had my dignity, my integrity, and the knowledge that I hadn't let them get away with their betrayal. Over the next week, everything unraveled for Emily and Paul. The group text had spread like wildfire, reaching colleagues, acquaintances, and even neighbors. Paul was forced to resign from his job after the scandal became the talk of his office. Emily became a pariah among our social circle, her reputation irreparably tarnished. Divorce papers were filed quickly, mine for Emily and Linda's for Paul. Neither of them fought back. They didn't beg for forgiveness or try to defend themselves. They knew there was no salvaging what they had destroyed. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, determined to start fresh. The nights were lonely at first, but the peace of knowing I'd taken control of my life made it bearable. I wasn't just surviving, I was rebuilding. In the end, the message I'd sent out wasn't just a revenge play. It was a declaration, I wouldn't be a victim. And if they thought they could betray me without consequences, they had learned just how wrong they were.